Postgame Show. You're watching us on 6abc.com and also the JAKIB Sports YouTube channel. Thanks for hanging with us on a New Year's Day as the Eagles lose today 20-10. A very unexpected result, but next week they could still clinch that number one seed. There'll be all kinds of discussions on what that game's going to be like, and we'll talk about that just before we let you guys go today. But let's talk some injuries, and let's bring in our sports doc, Dr. Bruce Grossinger, joins us. Hello, Doc. Happy New Year to you. Now, first of all, I got to talk about the Jalen injury because it's obviously the most important on what's going to happen next week. Talk us through what he has, how long it's logistically able to heal, and whether he could be ready for next week. And do you expect that joint to have healed by next week?
Yes, it's clear, and John McMullen was very helpful in amplifying that he has a grade 2, a moderate strain of the sternoclavicular joint. It's not totally displaced, and as Seth mentioned, he was able to play well in the second half, and he threw 2 30-yard balls. So because of that, I think they kept him out using an abundance of caution, as they tend to do. I believe that with therapy in another week, he will play next week. It's a very meaningful game against the Giants, but it was their decision to not play him. And I think John pointed out how they were kind of trotting him out like a show pony just so the Saints would prepare for him.
Hey, Doc. You're okay. As a doctor, you would be okay to say he's able to play the third weekend.
I want to make it clear. I give a little caveat here, or a disclaimer, that I haven't examined him. So I have to always mention that because I wouldn't want a viewer to think that I know directly. Without examining him, I am speculating. But if we presume he has full range of motion, his pain is under control, and he's able to throw medium, range, 10 to 20 yard throws, not necessarily 60 yards, I would definitely clear him to play for next week. It's a very meaningful game.
Hey, Doc, I want to ask you about this Lane Johnson injury because he irritates it one game, does further damage on this abductor injury the next game, and now we're at a point where he's out until the playoffs and might be out a little bit beyond that. What are we talking about in terms of exactly what this injury is? And we know that everybody heals differently, but for a guy who plays the position that he does, what kind of legitimate time frame are we talking about here?
Well, he has what I would call sports hernia. They haven't used that word, but they talked about a core muscle injury. Right. So it's really an injury to the rectus abdominis muscle and the oblique, and it's unilateral. It's more to one side. So it's really about pain control, and he's wearing a brace right now. I believe that he already has that hernia that will require repair, and he is a very tough guy. So they're going to keep him out to the playoffs about 3 or 4 weeks, depending on what seed they have. But after the season, he's going to get a full repair, and I expect a full recovery for Lane Johnson.
Okay.
Doc, tell us if anything, you've heard anything about Josh Sweat. It looked like to me he probably had a little stinger in the neck. They took him to the hospital, had to cart him off. Looked more like it was more precautionary than anything, the way that he was, kind of banging his hands on the ground as he laid on the ground. So it was pretty obvious that he had motion. But he goes to the hospital. From what we understand, he's been released. Any news on whether that's actual, concussion type deal or a neck injury, and what's the prognosis for him being available next week?
That's a great question. In fact, the fact that you just told me he was released from the hospital tells me a lot, Seth. I'm sure he had x-rays. That's the first thing you do. You immobilize the spine. They did a great job. Even the way the cart was moving slowly, they did a beautiful job. And they didn't put him in the locker room for cross-table lateral and AP. They sent him right to the hospital. That's state of the art. Presumably, he had an MRI. If you recall Matthew Stafford in December, last month actually, he's out with a spinal cord contusion. So Stafford had normal x-rays, but on his MRI, there was bright signal in his spinal cord. So that means there was bruising and bleeding in the spinal cord. Stafford is going to have a full recovery. But if that was the case, we could presume there's no way they would have let him leave. We still don't know whether he had a concussion. I watched the play over and over again. and I saw that it was really a high velocity hit on the fullback, and it was head and neck. And at the very end there, his own guy kind of, was trying to tackle. There was also an impact to his neck from his own guy, number 72, one of the defensive tackles. So he laid on the ground for a few seconds. If you recall, they kept him on the ground for a long time. So why was he motionless? Could have been a stinger, which is really a shock to the neck, which is transient and benign, Seth, or it could have been a concussion, really. So we still don't know whether there's a concussion at play or whether this was a contusion, concussion of the spinal cord. So the fact he's discharged, we presume there's no bleeding to the spinal cord, no fracture, no need to further immobilize or put him in a halo. But beyond that, I think we're going to watch closely to see whether they put him in a concussion protocol.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Bruce, just a follow-up on Lane. He obviously needs surgery, and to me, that means that he can't possibly be 100% when he does play again in the playoffs. As an offensive lineman, you need that core strength. How much do you think that affects him as a player?
Well, we think of there are three different layers. It gets boring if we get into anatomy, but luckily there's three different layers. So there's three shells of protection. He's also going to wear a really good brace. So I believe he's going to, if he had an unstable hernia or his bowel was protruding, they would send him to surgery. They wouldn't play around with it. So I believe he'll be about 80 to 90%. That would be my approximation.
Okay. Dr. Bruce, helpful information. We appreciate it. Thanks for hanging out with us on New Year's Day. And Happy New Year to you and your family.
Happy New Year to you all. And
Happy New Year, Doc.
Good to see you.
Happy New Year, Doc.
All right. That's Dr. Bruce.